Protests in the Georgian capital, Tbilisi, and the rest of the country are being watched closely from all sides. I'm Dr. K. I'm a political scientist who looks at how information is shared, and I want to give you a few things to keep an eye on. First off, let's talk about some narratives that are being used to explain what's happening in Georgia. Narratives are a way to shape how people understand political events by simplifying them to influence public opinion or support. In October 2024, a parliamentary election was held in Georgia, and the ruling Georgian Dream Party was declared the winner. But independent observers identified large-scale election fraud, so large that many world leaders were reluctant to recognize the results. Georgians took to the streets and demanded transparency about the elections. The scope of the protest widened on November 8th when the ruling government announced that it would postpone the negotiations for Georgia to join the EU until 2028. The protests have been called the Georgian Maidan. The Maidan protests that began in November 2013 in Ukraine for pretty much the same reason. Politicians going back on their promise about the EU. A narrative can mean many things. The Kremlin spokesperson warned that Georgia should not follow Ukraine's model, promoting the narrative that these protests are not organic, but instigated by foreign actors or foreign agents, an idea often reflected in legislation that is Russian-influenced, such as foreign agent laws. These laws have been used to shut down civil society, human rights advocacy, and independent journalism in Russia. And a similar law was passed, vetoed, and overruled in Georgia. This narrative about foreign agents was used by the Kremlin in response to not only Ukraine's Maidan and what's happening in Georgia, but also protests going back to 1991 in the Baltics, or as recent as the protests in Belarus that started in 2020. But all of these protests were not just about wanting to live in countries that were more democratic or more Western. These protests, including what's happening in Georgia now, tie in to national identity. The chant Sarkatvelo, the traditional regional name for Georgia, is what protesters are shouting. This is tied to Georgia's efforts to reclaim its cultural identity from centuries of Russian colonialism. Georgia was incorporated into the Soviet Union in 1921, and like in Ukraine, Georgian culture, language, and history was suppressed or reframed to fit Soviet propaganda. Indigenous terms like Sarkatvelo were exchanged for Russian ones. Since gaining independence in 1991, Georgia has worked to revive its traditions and language. In August 2008, Russia invaded Georgia's South Ossetia region in a move that was later seen as the playbook for the annexation of Ukraine's Crimea. A few years later, in 2012, a Russian-made billionaire established the Georgian Dream Party, the party whose election victory is being questioned. And because of Russia's war in Ukraine, between March and November 2022, over 1.2 million Russian citizens entered Georgia. Some were fleeing political persecution, but a lot were avoiding conscription. Over 110,000 have stayed in Georgia. And for a small country of just 3.7 million, this presence is massive. For a country that has already been partially invaded by Russia, it makes people nervous. Will the chant Sarkatvelo be seen as anti-Russian? Anti-Russian enough to warrant Russian troops coming in to protect Russian speakers, as was one of the justifications for invading Ukraine? What's interesting about the narratives is how the same stories are being told in different ways. These narratives often simplify really complex realities, turning national identity into nationalism or equating calls for democratic freedom with foreign meddling. By examining these narratives critically, we can better understand not just what's happening in Georgia. The way the stories are told and by whom is important. I'm Dr. K.